Oh, well, this is exciting. Earlier today, we're being told tourists and National Trust rangers saw the legendary fin disappear into a magical doorway within the rock face here at the Giant's Causeway.
An Irish archaeologist drilled through a section of basalt just meters from the moving stone door at the Giant's Causeway, and what his camera recorded on the other side doesn't match anything found in natural rock formations. The opening itself was narrow, barely wide enough to feed equipment through, but the space behind it wasn't. It extended, straight, structured, music, and about 12 meters in, the footage begins to show something that shouldn't exist at all. This is what he found. The man claims to be Kieran Oria. He's allegedly a former field archaeologist who spent years working on subsurface surveys and structural analysis across Ireland before stepping away from the field entirely. Most of his work had been methodical, slow, data-driven, rooted in known geological behavior and documented excavation standards. He wasn't known for speculation. He didn't publish fringe theories. If anything, colleagues described him as cautious to a fault, which is why what happened next doesn't fit easily into the rest of his career. He said he wasn't part of the original investigation into the moving stone door. In fact, there was no formal investigation at all, just scattered footage, short clips, and second-hand reports passed between researchers and enthusiasts. Most of it was dismissed quickly. Basalt formations don't open, they fracture, they collapse, they weather over time, but they don't move cleanly, and they certainly don't reseal without leaving evidence behind. Still, when Oria saw the footage, he paused on something others ignored: the edge, not the motion itself, but the boundary where movement had occurred. It was too clean, too consistent. Basalt formed through rapid cooling of lava creates columnar structures defined by stress fractures. Those fractures are irregular at the microscopic level even when they appear geometric from a distance. Any displacement, natural or otherwise, should leave micro-fractures, dust displacement, or at minimum, a visible seam. But in the footage, there was nothing. No crumbling edges, no debris, no distortion of surrounding stone. Just a shift, controlled, precise, and then stillness. That was enough. He didn't contact a university. He didn't apply for access permits. He didn't notify any geological survey bodies operating in the area. Instead, he went to the site himself, quietly, alone. According to him, he arrived without documentation, without a crew, and without any intention of drawing attention to what he was doing. The equipment he brought wasn't unusual for subsurface analysis, but the way he used it was. At the center of it was a Hilti TE-70 rotary hammer, a professional-grade drilling system designed for heavy masonry and reinforced stone. It was fitted with a 40mm carbide-tipped masonry bit extended through a series of couplings. The configuration allowed him to reach significant depth without widening the entry point, minimizing surface disturbance and reducing the risk of structural collapse around the drill site. But the drill itself wasn't the key. The location was. Oria didn't attempt to breach the visible face of the cliff where the reported movement had occurred. That would have been too obvious and too difficult. Basalt at that thickness would resist direct penetration for hours, possibly days, and any breakthrough would risk destabilizing the surrounding structure. Instead, he searched for weakness. Basalt doesn't form as a single uniform mass. As lava cools, it contracts, creating layered densities and internal stress variations. These differences aren't visible from the surface, but to someone trained in reading geological patterns, grain orientation, fracture alignment, thermal flow direction, they can be inferred. He spent hours mapping the rock manually. No digital scanners, no ground-penetrating radar, just physical inspection, touch and measurement. He traced subtle variations in the stone, slight shifts in texture, minor differences in coloration, almost imperceptible changes in how the surface reflected light. These were indicators, not proof, but suggestion enough to narrow down a location where the rock might be thinner or at least less resistant. Eventually, he chose a point not directly adjacent to the stone door, but close enough that any internal structure running parallel to it might intersect. He set the drill, positioned it carefully, and began. The first layer behaved exactly as expected, dense, unyielding. The resistance pushed back through the tool with a steady, predictable force. The vibration pattern was consistent with solid volcanic rock. No cavities, no fractures, no anomalies. Dust expelled from the borehole matched the fine, dark particulate typical of basalt under stress. He continued slowly measured, maintaining pressure, adjusting angle, compensating for heat buildup. Minutes passed, then more. Nothing changed until it did. The shift wasn't gradual. There was no warning, no softening of resistance, no change in sound. One moment, the drill was cutting through solid stone. The next, it wasn't. The resistance dropped instantly. The force required to maintain forward motion disappeared so suddenly that the drill advanced several inches before he could react. The vibration through the tool changed from a dense grinding feedback to something hollow, empty, open space. He stopped immediately, cut power, and held position. For several seconds, he didn't move at all. Then slowly, he pulled the drill back, just enough to confirm what had happened. There was no debris surge, no collapse, no secondary fracture, just a clean transition from solid basalt to nothing. A void exactly where there shouldn't be one. And at that point, he already knew that whatever might be captured inside it wouldn't all be possible to show in full. He didn't widen the opening right away. Instead, he listened. No airflow, no echo, no detectable movement from within. Whatever space existed beyond that point, it wasn't venting to the outside. It was sealed, contained, and until that moment, completely hidden. Only then did he begin to expand the entry point just enough to allow a secondary system through, because whatever was on the other side, he wasn't going in after it himself. He held position, let the camera stabilize, and this is what the footage showed. What appears in the next part of the recording is where everything changes. This is as far as we can show here. The full uncut footage continues. It's in the pinned comment. What he claims the camera captured inside that space isn't something we can fully show here on YouTube. Not because of clarity, because of what appears in frame and what doesn't stay still long enough to be clearly seen. The full unblurred footage, along with the frame-by-frame breakdown, music, is available in our Unseen archive on Patreon. What you're seeing here has already been limited. The rest hasn't been released publicly. Link is below. The layout becomes clearer. The floor beneath the suspended forms is darker, stained, uneven. Shallow pools of liquid scatter the light into broken reflections. What lies deeper? Beyond the first cluster of suspended forms, the environment changes again. Not abruptly, but enough to register. The crawler passes beneath the last of the hanging shapes, and for a brief moment, the ceiling above clears. The light spreads more evenly, no longer interrupted by the dull, absorbing surfaces that had dominated the previous section. Visibility improves slightly, but only for a few meters. Then, the atmosphere thickens. It isn't visible at first as a distinct layer or boundary. Instead, it reveals itself through interference. The light from the crawler's lens begins to scatter more aggressively, diffusing outward in a faint haze. Edges soften. Contrast drops. The depth of field becomes harder to judge. Moisture suspended in the air, not heavy enough to drip, at least not yet, but dense enough to distort the camera's perception of distance. The floor begins to shift. Up to this point, it had remained relatively level, unnaturally so, compared to the rough basalt nearer the entry point. But now, subtle irregularities return. The surface darkens in patches, music absorbing more light than the surrounding stone. The crawler's tracks leave faint impressions as it moves forward, compressing a thin layer of something softer than rock, water, or something close to it. Shallow pooling becomes visible in low areas. Thin, uneven layers that reflect the crawler's light in fractured, broken patterns. The reflections don't form music-clean mirror images. They distort, ripple slightly, even when the crawler itself is stationary. The liquid isn't still, or the surface beneath it isn't stable. Oria slows the crawler. The camera angle dips slightly, focusing on the ground. There's no clear flow direction, no visible source feeding the pooling. The liquid appears to gather in shallow depressions, held in place by the uneven surface, rather than moving through it. The color is difficult to define, dark, almost black under direct light. But when the angle shifts, faint variations appear, tones that separate slightly from the surrounding basalt, suggesting it isn't just water sitting on stone. The crawler moves again, carefully. The tracks maintain traction, but not perfectly. There's a slight delay between input and response, a subtle slip as the unit pushes forward through the dampened surface. Then the ceiling changes. At first, it's easy to miss the light, catches something that doesn't match the surrounding texture, something linear, cutting across the natural flow of the rock above. The camera tilts upward and the pattern becomes clearer. There are structures embedded in the ceiling, not protruding, not hanging like the formations behind, integrated, running horizontally across the space, intersecting the ceiling at regular intervals. They resemble beams, subtle, partially obscured by the surrounding material, but distinct enough to break the natural continuity of the basalt. They don't follow the organic fracture lines typical of volcanic stone. Instead, they cut across them, maintaining straight paths where the rock itself would normally curve or break. Reinforcement, or at least something behaving like it. The spacing is consistent, measured, each structure positioned at intervals that mirror the patterns seen in the suspended forms earlier. The implication is difficult to ignore. The two are connected. Whatever supports those shapes, whatever they're attached to, extends through the ceiling itself. The crawler continues forward beneath these embedded lines. The air grows heavier. Condensation on the lens increases, small droplets forming and merging into larger distortions that shift with the crawler's movement. The image quality degrades, forcing Oria to rely more on motion and shape than on fine detail. Still, he continues further in. The distance from the entry point increases 10 meters, 15. The signal remains stable, but not perfectly. There are brief fluctuations, small bursts of interference that ripple through the feed before stabilizing again. Nothing sustained, nothing that forces a stop, but enough to register. Then, a change. It happens quickly, so quickly that at first it's easy to miss a flare of light, brighter than the crawler's LEDs. Not by a large margin, but enough to stand out against the otherwise controlled illumination. It appears ahead, just beyond the current field of view, a brief expansion of brightness that reflects off the moisture in the air, creating a momentary bloom across the lens. Then, it's gone. No source, no residual glow. The camera captures it frame by frame, but there's no clear origin point, no identifiable object or surface producing the light. Aurea pauses the crawler, holds position, waits. Nothing happens. The space ahead remains dark, unchanged. He reviews the feed in real time, scrubbing back slightly, isolating the frames where the flare occurred. It's there, consistent across frames, not a glitch, not a reflection from the crawler itself. Something external, something within the space. He resumes movement slowly. The crawler advances toward where the flare had appeared. The ground softens further. The tracks begin to struggle, not failing, but working harder to maintain forward motion. The surface beneath the thin liquid layer gives slightly under pressure, reducing traction with each movement. The depth of the pooling increases only by a small margin, but enough to matter. The crawler dips slightly in certain sections, one track losing grip momentarily before correcting. The signal degrades again, this time more noticeably. Static flickers across the feed. The image distorts, then stabilizes, then distorts again. The further it goes, the less stable everything becomes. Aurea pushes it to approximately 20 meters. That's where it stops. Not by choice. The crawler loses traction. The ground beneath it no longer supports consistent movement. The track spins slightly, displacing the surface layer without gaining forward distance. At the same time, the signal interference increases, not constant, but frequent enough to risk losing the feed entirely. He holds position briefly, attempts minor adjustments. Nothing improves, so he makes the decision. He pulls it back slowly, carefully, retracing the same path. The suspended moisture continues to distort the image, but the structure remains visible as the crawler retreats. The embedded ceiling lines pass overhead again. The darker floor gives way to the firmer, more stable surface closer to the entry point. Then the suspended forms reappear, hanging, unchanged, still, but again, not completely. The same subtle inconsistencies, the same barely perceptible shifts, as if their position isn't entirely fixed. The crawler passes beneath them, continues back until the narrow opening comes into view. Light from the outside, faint, indirect, bleeds into the frame as the unit approaches the entry point. Then it exits back into open air. The operation ends there. Aurea doesn't reinsert the crawler, doesn't attempt a second pass. He removes the equipment, seals the opening, not permanently, but cleanly enough that from the outside there's no visible indication that anything had been done. No fracture lines, no residual debris, no sign of drilling. The rock face appears untouched, as if the entry point had never existed. And the stone door, the one that initiated all of this, hasn't been recorded opening again since. No further movement, no additional footage, nothing. But if the cavity he accessed runs parallel to that section of cliff, if what he found exists alongside the structure already observed, then whatever is behind that stone door isn't empty. It isn't a hollow. It isn't a natural void formed by geological processes alone. It's structured, deliberate, and completely concealed within solid volcanic rock. There's no official record of the drilling, no documentation, no published findings, no institutional acknowledgement that any such space exists. Only a single account from a man who mapped the rock himself, drilled through a thinner section, and sent a camera into the space behind it. He was careful in how he described it, measured, precise. But there was one thing he didn't hesitate on. He never called it natural. And if what he accessed is only part of a larger structure, if the section he reached is just one corridor alongside something more, then whatever sits behind that stone door still hasn't been fully seen. The footage doesn't show everything. It can't. The lens distorts. The moisture interferes. Depth is compressed. Light behaves unpredictably. And what appears in the recording now looks clearer than what he saw in real time. But even with those limitations, even with uncertainty, the conclusion didn't change. There was something there, and it wasn't supposed to be. So if that door opens again, if the mechanism that allowed it to move before repeats, the question isn't just what will be revealed. It's this: what's already waiting on the other side?